German nervousness about the Russian nuclear capability and the nuclear dimension of European defense has a very long story. I mean, going right back to the Cold War, when Germany was essentially going to be the nuclear battlefield in any confrontation with the Soviet Union. But I think the question now is whether you see a polarization in German politics and perhaps more broadly in European politics between rearmament, which includes a nuclear dimension, autonomous for Europe, and pacifism.
Hello, I'm Brendan Donnelly of the Federal Trust, and I'll be speaking today again with the chairman of the Federal Trust, John Stevens, about recent developments in European defence and security policy. We're going to talk later, John, about some very interesting and important remarks that Friedrich Merz made on the eve of his election victory. But can we take a step back and because those remarks seem to me to be the culmination of a month of reactions from European leaders to the first month of the new Trump administration. Clearly, many European leaders have felt uneasy and disquieted by that first month of the new administration. Can you tell me why that was? What were the sort of things that were said and done that made Europe's leaders uneasy?
Well, I think it goes back actually far earlier than the return of President Trump, because what has underpinned European caution about Ukraine and a constant deference to American leadership on Ukraine has been the fact that European defense depends upon the American nuclear umbrella. And Russia is obviously a nuclear power and has not been backward in threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the course of this war. Now, that has been vastly exacerbated by the return of President Trump, who has made it quite clear that he really has no interest in honoring the nuclear backstop that America has provided under the structure of NATO. And that, of course, is, particularly for the Germans, a very, very worrying position, because they have relied more than anyone else, really, on this American connection for their security. And so the confrontation with the reality that the American nuclear umbrella is no longer available for Europe brings with it really a fundamental change in the security architecture and the need for a European nuclear deterrent in some form.
Why has American commitment, even before Trump, to providing a nuclear backstop for Europe, why has that been waning?
Well, because United States policy has been pivoting towards a confrontation with China focused on the Pacific. But people still trusted Biden to provide that nuclear umbrella, but his caution towards Russia, because of the danger of a nuclear confrontation that would involve the United States, did underpin a lot of the backwardness in supporting the Ukrainian war effort. And that was particularly true in the attitudes of the Germans. And there is a question of if we had been more forward in giving support to Ukraine at various stages of the war, particularly after the success of their initial counteroffensive at the end of 22, we might not be where we are now. But the point is that with Trump back in the White House and a clear disavowal by the US administration of its responsibilities under NATO for a nuclear umbrella, I mean, that has really brought all this to a head.
Were you surprised at the vigor with which Merz set about setting out his stall last night?
No, I'm not, because this has been building, as I say, over a period. And German nervousness about the Russian nuclear capability and the nuclear dimension of European defense has a very long story. I mean, going right back to the Cold War, when Germany was essentially going to be the nuclear battlefield in any confrontation with the Soviet Union. But I think the question now is whether we see a polarization in German politics and perhaps more broadly in European politics between rearmament, which includes a nuclear dimension, autonomous for Europe, and pacifism. And the appeal of the AfD in the election campaign was not actually primarily about immigration. Not that immigration wasn't an important part of their position, but what actually came to the fore, particularly in the meetings towards the end of the campaign, was actually them saying, well, we are the peace party. We don't want to be in a war with Russia. We don't want to have rearmament. They were playing to an audience which, in many respects, given the past antecedents of the AfD, might seem rather strange to some. They were not natural pacifists, one would have thought. But their commitment to the links to Russia and their play on not wanting a rearmed Germany, I think, does explain a significant part of their improved vote performance in the election.
Who do you think will form the new coalition? Will it just be between the CDU and the SPD, or will the Greens, who have taken a very robust attitude towards Ukraine, will they be part of the mix? And if so, might it make it easier to gain a consensus around substantial rearmament in Germany?
I think what Merz wants is a coalition simply with the Social Democrats. But he does believe that that would be sufficient to create a consensus in favor of rearmament, which would have the support of the Greens outside the coalition. The problem of the Greens is really the nuclear power issue, which of course does have a link to nuclear weapons. And that is, I think, one reason why the current situation suggests that it'll be a grand coalition and nothing more. The real problem, however, is that it looks as though there won't be the two-thirds majority that is required in the Bundestag to change the constitutional block on deficit financing, which was put in under Frau Merkel. And that is a problem for substantially increased defense expenditure. But actually, the costs of building up a nuclear capacity for Germany and other partners in the European Union are not that substantial. And they're actually much less than a conventional rearmament would be. Certainly a conventional rearmament along the lines that have hitherto been assumed. Although, of course, the whole conventional warfare picture and the economics of it has been transformed by the advent of drone warfare on a very large scale, because drones are actually very cheap. So this barrier may not be quite as significant as hitherto perceived.
What will be the European implications and the integrative implications of this, where apparently Germany and France on this central issue are now singing very similar tunes?
Well, there's nothing more integrating than defense and the requirements of a command and control that brings with it. And there's nothing more powerful in defense than nuclear weapons. So, I mean, this is a very big step, and I think must accelerate the creation of a politically integrated architecture in Europe in some form or other. The precise form that takes remains to be seen. And the precise relationship that a European deterrent takes vis-a-vis the institutions of the European Union and things, that all these are very open questions. But this is an enormous step forward. European strategic autonomy, if it is brought about in the form currently being contemplated in Berlin now, and certainly in Paris, that is an enormous change. And it has support, actually, far more broadly. It has support in Poland, it has support in Italy, Spain. This is not just a a Franco-German situation. And it has potentially, and this is what Merz desires, a dimension with the UK, because although our current nuclear force has a dependence upon America, and this raises all sorts of very awkward problems for the British, we do have also very significant expertise in nuclear weapons generally, which is relevant for the gap that exists really in European nuclear defense, which is not the strategic level, it is the tactical level, it is the intermediate weapons which Putin has been threatening to use on a fairly regular basis.
But would any British government, even or perhaps particularly Keir Starmer's government, not find it difficult to participate wholeheartedly in this European rearmament if it's presented as a manifestation of strategic autonomy? As long as the non-American aspect of it wasn't stressed, then it might have been much easier for the British to go along with it. I wonder if they will be able, politically and domestically, to embrace the Merz and the Macron analysis that the European Union needs to be strategically autonomous, not merely vis-à-vis Russia, but vis-à-vis the United States as well.
Well, of course, you're quite right. I mean, we've been discussing for quite a while between us the way in which British politics is potentially polarizing in a pro-American, pro-European divide. And it will be very difficult for the British to accept a European defense without America, because that has been the cornerstone of our entire approach to NATO, and the distinction that we've always made between NATO and European integration via the EU. This is absolutely fundamental. And clearly, although we have operational independence in our nuclear deterrent, it is in every technical sense deeply dependent upon the Americans. And for us to take an overtly anti-American position, or one that is replacing the Americans, does put in question whether American support, technical support for the maintenance of our deterrent in the medium term would continue. And then there is also the whole question of intelligence cooperation, which has been very, very deep, Five Eyes and the rest, and our dependence on US satellite systems and things. I mean, we are much more locked into the United States military than any other European power. And therefore, if it comes to a disentanglement, it is much, much more difficult for the British to accept. And of course, the divisions created by Brexit will be massively amplified by all this. And so I repeat, I do think that we are heading towards a position in which there will be, in effect, a pro-American and a pro-European divide in our politics.
On what side of that divide might Keir Starmer and his Labour Party stand?
Well, the problem is that the Labour Party is divided on this. It's perhaps slightly less polarized than the Conservatives, although not necessarily, because the Conservatives in their current leadership are very much sold on the American line, although it has been a greater shock for them, I think, Trump's 180-degree reversal on Ukraine, because of the way in which Johnson's, when he was prime minister, championing of Ukraine was so central to perceptions of the last Conservative government, and seen as one of the successes of the last Conservative government was that we were sound on Ukraine. And of course, that has now been totally reversed. So, I mean, this is going to be very, very divisive, I think, for all political parties to a greater or lesser degree, and cuts right across the traditional spectrum of our party politics.
Mr. Macron and Sir Keir Starmer are both expected in Washington this week. What sort of a reception will they receive? Will it be different as between the two of them, or will they be equally fobbed off as apparently the Polish president was at the weekend?
Well, I don't think Trump is very interested in allies. That's quite clear. But I think he will be more cautious and has apparently a somewhat better relationship with President Macron than he has with Keir Starmer. Uh, I think the question really is whether the Americans care about their interventions in British politics and would seek, therefore, to influence the way in which Britain goes, as distinct from the way in which the EU goes. And of course, we have already seen the readiness of both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and above all, perhaps the real president, Mr. Musk, to concentrate and intervene in British politics. That Vance mentioned Britain in his speech to the Munich Security Conference, a bizarre speech, was, I think, quite telling. So this is going to be a rougher ride for Britain than it is for the Continentals, but it's going to be a rough ride for everybody.
Well, on that cheery note, let's finish the conversation, and thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll continue with these issues and revert to them often in the coming months. Thank you, John.